Okay, so this cartoon right here shows you the level of frustration with the embargo. The embargo had essentially shut down trade between the U.S. and everybody else. Jefferson's idea was that the embargo would somehow keep the U.S. out of the conflict because we wouldn't be trading. Our ships wouldn't be going all over the seas, and we just wouldn't play. We just don't want to play with them, right? Except that this embargo impacts all trade. And like I said before, it crashes the economy. So people hate the embargo. Now, the Democrat Republicans, Jefferson won't run for a third term. The Democrat Republicans will take a political hit, but Madison will go ahead and win the presidency. But he'll win the presidency basically by differing from Jefferson by saying, yeah, I like Jefferson, we're in the same party, but I don't agree with his policies on the embargo. So he's going to turn his back on the embargo and, basically says, I'm going to fix the economy. We're going to resolve stuff with Europe. We're going to find a way to, we're going to figure our way out of this. And so one of the first things he's going to do is repeal the Embargo Act and replace it with the Non-Intercourse Act. What that means is we'll trade, instead of not trading with anybody, we'll trade with Britain and France, or we'll trade with the rest of the world except Britain and France, I'm sorry. And so, and that would allow us to maybe improve our economy. Except it doesn't, because really, who else is there in, 1808 to trade with, So what's going to happen is that we then have to reopen trade with Britain and France, and we basically say, okay, just don't violate our neutrality, right? Respect our neutrality, and we'll keep trading with you. Except it's not going to work that way, okay? And one of the reasons it's not going to work that way is that pesky little Louisiana Purchase, right? Remember me saying that it had some soft boundaries, right? There were some differences of opinion as to exactly what the boundaries of this purchase were. And for Americans, they see it as basically a free-for-all. So they're jumping over, or they're moving westward. They're putting pressure on American Indians. American Indians know that, the American government is ineffective when talking about, enforcing treaties and enforcing agreements. So they're turning to the British to help them. And so the British start to build some forts in what Americans are calling their territory. And of course, the British are doing this because they're a little bit worried that, given the way Americans like to grab land, that they're going to start grabbing land in Canada. So they're putting in forts. They're also kind of encouraging the American Indians to resist and kind of giving them tips and some weapons and stuff like that. So this is going to create what is called the Pan-Indian movement. And so this is another variation of what we saw with Chief Little Turtle. This is going to essentially, you're going to have Tecumseh. He's going to lead kind of this group to make a difference as far as fighting back the Americans. Really, the British are kind of using them as the tip of the spear, if you will, to kind of stop the Americans. Except, of course, William Henry Harrison, the Battle of Tippecanoe. He'll be president. We'll mention him later on. But he will, he's going to defeat the Tecumseh and that Pan-Indian movement. And again, don't mess with Western expansion, right? Don't tell Americans where they can't go. Don't tell them you can't come this direction, because Western expansion is incredibly, incredibly important. In addition, trade is incredibly, incredibly important. So that last bullet point there is a huge factor as far as the causes for the French Revolution. War of 1812, sorry, it's been a long day. And so the U.S. wants trade, we want Western expansion, and, we're trying to resolve the issues with Britain and France, and we're trying to resolve these issues with American Indians. Now, one of the issues with the War of 1812 is that, first off, Britain and France are not respecting American neutrality. They're still seizing ships. They're basically stealing the cargo. That Britain's still impressing soldiers. That's making people mad. You've got this perception that Britain has encouraged Tecumseh to rise up and interfering with Western expansion. So there's a lot of Americans that feel like Britain's back to its old tricks, back to its, 1770 tricks, if you will. Or 1777 tricks. And so there's a lot of resentment against Great Britain. There's a sense that they're not going to listen and respect American neutrality, that somehow we have no other choice. And so basically, Congress will ultimately make a case for war, and they will vote for war. Now, what's interesting is that thanks to slow transportation, you actually had a message coming from Britain, which was an apology saying, yes, yes, we're really sorry, we won't do it ever again. Now, whether they would have held up that end of the deal is debatable. But certainly Congress declares war, and then a few days later finds out, oh, hey, we had a message from Great Britain. But they go ahead and stick to the war declaration, right? And so you have this group of war hawks, people that had not been involved in the Revolutionary War. These are newer people. These are often Westerners from these newer states. Henry Clay is the most famous of those. There's also a real interest in gaining Florida, right? Because remember, Spain still has control of Florida, even though we've gotten a little bit of Florida territory. Spain and Britain are allies, so hey, if we can defeat Britain in the War of 1812, then we can use that as leverage to get Spain or get Florida from Spain and have more coastline. So, and so you have kind of this idea of these war hawks having this justification, not only of the lack of respect and the trade problems and Western expansion, but you've also got this idea of what could be gained from the war. Now, unfortunately, war hawks typically don't always think things through, and so the U.S. is going to struggle a little bit at first, and, you know, you have kind of this, you know, every time they go up north, every time they try to attack Britain and Canada, they fail and they lose. Now, they do pretty much have tight control of the Great Lakes region. And the British will try to blockade us, but the problem is that this blockade is not going to be as effective as the British would have liked. Remember, the British are spread kind of thin because they're also fighting Napoleon. Now they've got to fight the Americans again. So a lot of the same characteristics that led to Britain kind of walking away from North America and the American Revolution are going to happen in the War of 1812. And so, but the one thing that's going to develop from 1812 to 1814 is that the blockade is going to make the manufacturing sector grow, because when you can't get foreign goods, you have to make the goods here at home. So it actually has kind of this unintended consequence of strengthening our manufacturing system. Britain will burn Washington, D.C. in 1814. This is the famous story of Dolly Madison saving the portrait of George Washington. But the thing is, the British don't want to occupy Washington, D.C., right? They burn it down and they leave. And so when Napoleon abdicates in 1814, the British are just tired of fighting. I mean, they've been, you know, they fought the American Revolution, and then they got involved in fighting the French because of the French Revolution. Then they've been fighting Napoleon. They're just kind of tired of it. They just don't want to deal with it anymore. And the Americans are hard to handle. So we'll just, you know, fine, let's reach a peace agreement. So one of the things that's going to cause an end to the Federalists is that in December of 1814, you're going to have a group of Federalists get together, and they're saying that this whole War of 1812 is the fault of the Democrat Republicans. You know, they're the ones that supported war. We didn't support war. Remember, the whole Declaration was a split Congress. And, you know, and they don't like the results, and they feel like Jefferson mismanaged the whole thing. And so the Hartford Convention in 1814, 1815 is actually an attempt to have England annex New England. And so when the press comes out, of course, this is going to happen about the same time that we have the end of the war. Now, part of the reason why all this happens at the same time is the slow pace of communication. It takes forever for communication to get sent and received. So the war ends, and you have the Treaty of Ghent in December of 1814 that says, oh, hey, we're done fighting, right? We're, you know, enough of this. Let's just go back to being business partners. We work a lot better just as business partners rather than trying to fight with each other. And so that's going to happen about the same time that the Hartford Convention is sending overtures to Great Britain to, hey, why don't you annex us? To which Great Britain says, sorry, we've already made a treaty. And then Americans look at the Federalists and they're like, you people are nuts. You wanted to tear apart our country. How dare you? Now, what's interesting here is that, of course, by 1860, our attitude towards secession is a whole different thing. But this will kill the Federalist Party because of that Hartford Convention. And, of course, Andrew Jackson will have his infamous victory in New Orleans in January of 1815. Again, part of this is because of the slow pace of communication. So he will not have word that we've actually ended the war. Neither will the British, and so they will fight each other in New Orleans, and Andrew Jackson will basically kick their butt. And so this is going to give Andrew Jackson a lot of fame, and this is going to be one of the things that will help propel him into politics, is because of his success against the British in the Battle of New Orleans. So just kind of a quick run through of the War of 1812. There's more to it. Of course, you've got the creation of the national anthem by Francis Scott Key. And of course, if you ever make it to the Smithsonian Institute, they have the flag that the Star-Spangled Banner was written about. That's really fascinating to see. This gives you a little bit of an idea of what we're talking about as far as the battles and as far as the blockade. Again, the British were really pretty distracted during this whole conflict, and so that's part of why, that's part of why they don't really win. And they kind of walk away. And of course, the U.S. is going to have this defense of the country. That's going to allow them to claim the victory because they're able to dig in and hold ground. They aren't successful when they go off and attack, but they are successful when they hold their ground. And so it's very similar to the French Revolution. It becomes about how much do the British want to exert their effort. And what they, again, like I said, they decide they don't want to, that what they'd rather do is focus on business relationships and trade. And of course, so it's after the War of 1812 that the demand for cotton, both by British manufacturers and then of course by American manufacturers that have been helped, will make such a huge difference. As far as the expansion of slavery and the plantation system and stuff like that. So the results of the War of 1812, we basically have the solidified independence, finally, where we're seen as our own independent country. A lot of this comes from Britain just finally accepting, yes, fine, they're on their own, as well as the idea that things have kind of settled down into an equilibrium in Europe now that Napoleon's gone. Britain and the United States will begin their long history of kind of this close working relationship. They'll have a commercial treaty that's basically free trade. They'll establish the northern boundary of the U.S., although that gets a little dicey a couple of times, but the Rush-Bagot Agreement will hold on to that. And basically the Indians are left out in the cold. The British, once they don't have anything to gain from this, they basically walk away from the American Indians. So that's kind of your big result of the War of 1812. Other aspects that we see from the War of 1812 is the need for a stronger military, military academies, that sort of thing. You saw it a little bit with the role of the Barbary Pirates and the creation of a navy, but after the War of 1812, this need to have some kind of military, just in case, becomes a little more important. And this is a profound shift from what we saw in the Articles of Confederation, where the idea was, oh, all we really need are state militias. We don't need a standing military. We don't trust a standing military. So, this is one of those transitions that happens there. So people who are opposed to the Second Amendment would argue that we don't need the Second Amendment anymore because when it was written, they didn't expect to have a standing army, and now we have a standing army. Which is one way of looking at it. But you don't necessarily have to look at it that way because it says what it says. But you have the U.S. basically investing in itself, more industry tariffs because we have trade resuming. Lots of emphasis on internal improvements, canal systems, roads, even railroads. Steam power becomes a big thing. We've got a lot more factories. The water wheel becomes very important. The Bank of the United States becomes even more important. Of course, it was pretty crucial to the purchase of Louisiana. But it also becomes even more important because now that we're not dealing with kind of this turmoil in Europe, this, Britain versus France, Napoleon, all that kind of stuff, and we can focus instead on trade and business and capitalism and all that kind of stuff, the bank becomes very, very central to supporting this economic growth. This is what we call the era of good feelings, really, from roughly about 1814 till 1824. So you've got about 10 years where you really only have one party, and that's the Democrat-Republicans. Again, Federalists have gone away. They had been losing some traction, although they had a chance to maybe kind of gain a little bit because of Jefferson's poor management of the international tensions. But what you see is that when they have that whole Hartford Convention, people really are just kind of done with them. Which again, I think it's interesting that they talked about secession and largely get shut down. What the difference will be when you start talking about, the southern states seceding in 1860, that's much more acceptable. So you've got a profound shift in about 40 years about what is about the unity of the country that I think is fascinating. So you'll have this idea of an era of good feelings of one single party, and the idea that we are Americans, kind of this American mindset. One of the things we'll be talking about pretty soon into the start of the next quarter will be Alexis de Tocqueville and kind of the American identity. But there's still lots of regionalism too. We still have lots of differences, lots of different kind of areas, different interests, different factions, if you will. And so that's going to continue to be a thing. So James Monroe will become the president in 1816, and he will be president until you get to 1824. Some interesting side notes, just kind of miscellaneous. James Monroe was actually very important in the War of 1812. Madison, who was a really small guy, was not a military mind, right? He's an intellectual, right? He's a policy guy. And Monroe is the military guy. So Monroe really kind of becomes even though Madison has the title commander-in-chief, it is Monroe who really kind of orchestrates and runs the War of 1812. So that's kind of an interesting side note. So that kind of helps make sense why he so easily walks in. It helps that the Democrat-Republicans were in office when the War of 1812 was successfully concluded. That also helps give him some support. Another little tidbit I'll mention is Dolly Madison. She really establishes the role of the First Lady in a way that Martha Washington and Abigail Adams had not. And of course, Jefferson didn't have a wife. His daughter kind of served, and he hated politics, so he didn't really focus on this, which is probably partly why he either used strong executive power or didn't make good decisions. So it's going to be when James Madison comes in, and as I said, he's kind of intellectual. He's very much a policy guy. And so he's very much about that sort of aspect of politics, and he's not afraid of political parties, but he's not going to come out and confront people face to face. Well, his wife, Dolly Madison, is very gregarious, very outgoing. She's known for giving great parties and all this kind of stuff. And so she very much, works with her husband. And she would have these parties and these salons, and she would invite people of different opinions. When they were trying to get something accomplished, she would invite relevant people, and she would always orchestrate them talking together, and she would always kind of act as this intermediary, and she would do so in this really kind of soft power kind of way. So Dolly Madison is an interesting person as far as women in politics, as far as how she creates the role of the First Lady. And then you've got James Madison, who of course is a brilliant man. And I think we can learn a lot from looking at James Madison and how he navigated politics and what he thought about politics. So that kind of wraps up the idea of kind of the early republic that gets us all the way through the War of 1812. I know I rushed through the War of 1812. Mostly because it matters, because it solidifies American independence. It matters because of all the things that are on this last slide. But it also is really kind of, it's this marker. But fundamentally, the War of 1812 is about Europe resolving the issue with Napoleon, right? I mean, yes, it has profound implications for the United States. But it's not because the United States fought the war really well. It's because Europe moved past Napoleon. And so a lot of the problems that we saw emerging with the political parties from Washington's era all the way through the War of 1812 was because of the French Revolution, because of the different factions, because of Napoleon, because of Britain versus France. And so those tensions, once that's resolved, there's kind of this sense that, oh, okay, well, that problem's taken care of, right? We can now focus on ourselves. What's interesting is that some of the elements that will then create create the foundation of a strong American system, a strong American government, a strong United States, come about during this process of this whole hot mess that is Europe. Because you've got the Bank of the United States, you've got the Louisiana Purchase, you've got kind of the solidification of federal power, and understanding what the role of federal power is. You also have from this period really kind of this idea about laying the foundation for the Civil War, the idea of federal power versus state power, and what is federalism and what does federalism look like. So the War of 1812 matters, and this period of the early republic matters a lot, but it doesn't matter because of the military aspect of it. It's more about the outcomes of the military aspect of it. So hopefully this kind of helps you. We'll be looking at documents specific to this period. So as you're listening to this and as we look through documents in class, and as you read documents outside of class, this should help you kind of understand exactly what's going on.